Morning, everyone. Good morning. Hope you all had a wonderful week. It's a very beautiful Sabbath day. It's great to be here on this day of rest and rejuvenation. One of the crucifixion contradictions that the Skeptics Annotated Bible lists as being unanswered is the supposed contradiction between John chapter 19:14 and Mark chapter 15, verse 25. I want to take you here this morning and have you just read these two sections, very short sections of Scripture, so we can compare these two as we can try to deconstruct this and attempt to make a reconciliation of this supposed contradiction. So let's look first at Mark chapter 15, and let's just read the one Scripture here. Mark chapter 15, let's look at verse 24, Mark chapter 15. And when they had crucified him, they parted his garments, casting lots upon them what every man should take. And it was the third hour, and they crucified him. So this is what Mark says about the crucifixion. It was at the third hour they crucified him. And then if we look over in John chapter 19, and I want to read from 14 down to 16. It says, and it was the preparation of the Passover. John chapter 19:14. And about the sixth hour, and he said unto the king, behold your Jews, and they cried out, behold your king. And they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said unto them, shall I crucify your king? King. The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. And then they delivered him, therefore, unto them to be crucified. And they took Jesus and they led him away. So here we have two different scriptures who are supposedly saying two different things as far as the time frame of when Jesus Christ was crucified. This is important to at least have a little bit of an understanding of this, because these are things that people point to say the scriptures are not true, that they're not valid, that the people messed up, that these are just made up stories. So here we see that Mark records that Jesus was crucified, as it says, in the third hour, but John writes it was about the sixth hour when Pilate presented Jesus to the Jews and said, behold your king. Now this happened at the end of Jesus' final trial before Pilate, so the contradiction seems to be that John had Jesus' trial ending 3 hours after Mark says that Jesus was crucified. Bit of a problem here. We need to come to a reconciliation. The answer, which is presented in most commentaries, if you want to look up Barnes' notes, for instance, or Clark's, you'll see that what they will say on this passage is that throughout time, John's scribe, whoever wrote John down, made a scribal error. They wrote it down incorrectly. They claim that some ancient scribe mistook the Greek letter gamma for the letter sigma, for 6, and changed the original time of the third hour to the 6th hour. So I guess the question really we could ask is, why did Mark have to be wrong? John. Why did John have to be wrong? Why couldn't Mark be wrong? Well, Mark mentions the 6th hour a few verses later in chapter 15 when he describes the darkness that covered the earth from the 6th hour to the 9th hour. You'll remember that. So according to Mark, Jesus was crucified on the 3rd hour, and he hung on the tree for 3 hours before the earth was then covered with darkness, which lasted for another 3 hours, at which time Jesus cried with a loud voice, and then he died. Now, this is consistent with some of the reports that we see, or the scriptures that we see in Matthew as well, and Luke, and shows that the 3rd hour mentioned in Mark 25 could not be the same as the 6th hour. So the commentaries claim that the time given in John is wrong and not that which is given in Mark. So what if we take the commentaries at their word? What if we do that? We say, well, you're right about that. If John 19:14 originally said the 3rd hour, as they say it should be, rather than the 6th hour, then the events described in this portion of John should match the events which Mark says took place during the 3rd hour. But yet when we read Mark 15, we find that the 3rd hour mentioned in verse 25 is a reference to the time when Jesus was actually fastened to the tree and crucified. So the verses leading up to verse 25 have all of these things that happen. We have, for instance, Jesus being led away from his final trial from Pilate, then being given a purple robe and a crown of thorns, then being hit and mocked by the soldiers, then being stripped of the purple robe and given back his own clothes, then being led to Golgotha, then having Simon carry his cross, then being given wine mixed with myrrh to drink, and finally, after all of that, he was crucified. It's only the last of these events, the actual crucifixion, which is said by Mark to have occurred in the third hour. So when we turn to the account in John, however, we find a much different scene being described as the sixth hour than that which is described as the third hour in Mark. Now, in John's account, here's what we see. Jesus is still standing before Pilate at this time. And in the verses leading up to John 19:14, we read of Pilate attempting to release Jesus. So first, in John, what we see is he gave the people the choice between Jesus or Barabbas. And then he had Jesus scourged and brought him again before the Jews. The Jews still cried out for Jesus to be crucified, and Pilate said that he found no fault in him. Then the Jews said that Jesus should die because he claimed to be the Son of God, so Pilate queried Jesus again, and then he sought to release him. The Jews said that if Pilate didn't crucify Jesus, then he would be guilty of treason against Caesar. And Pilate then brought Jesus before the Jews and said, "Behold your king." And the Jews responded by shouting, "Crucify him." So this specific exchange is what John says takes place about the sixth hour. Now, there's another consideration here as well. Various skeptics have tried to use the reference to the sixth hour in John chapter 19 to mean the passage described took place around noon. So this is what they'll say, well, it happened around noon. But this just simply isn't possible because we know from the previous chapter in John chapter 18 and verse 28, it says, what were people doing? Remember when Peter denied Christ? Remember what he was doing? He was warming himself by the fire. So people were warming themselves. Well, in the Middle East at this time, it wouldn't have been cold enough to warm yourself by the fire, especially if the daylight was up. It's very cold at night, very chilly in the mornings, but as the sun comes up, it gets quite warm and pleasant at that time of the year. So they wouldn't have been doing that. Certainly not at noon, and not even a couple hours before noon. So that doesn't really make sense there. So a quick comparison of these two accounts shows that they're not describing the same event. Mark is speaking of the moment when Jesus was actually crucified, while John is referring to the time at which the Jews made their final demand for Jesus to be crucified. So if the commentaries are correct, and John 19:14 originally read the third hour, and it was simply a scribal error, then there would still be a contradiction, right, between these two passages, because they say they're supposed to be the same thing, and they're not. They're something completely different. They would then be claiming that Jesus was in two completely different places at the same time. And he could be, I suppose. But this didn't happen here. This is not what happened here. This shows us that the solution presented by the commentaries is really incorrect, but it also reveals to us the possibility of a different solution as well. In the events described in John 19 and Mark 15, you'll notice that both accounts mention Christ being given that purple robe and a crown of thorns and being hit and mocked by the Roman soldiers. The fact that this event is described in both accounts gives us finally our first point of correlation. This is where we can say we come together here. This is where we have this first point of correlation which we can use to solve the supposed contradiction. The next point of correlation is the fact that both accounts record Jesus being led from Pilate's hall to Golgotha to be crucified. The first point of correlation occurred before both the sixth hour of John's account and before the third hour of Mark's account. But the second correlating factor event is after the sixth hour of John and before the third hour of Mark. I know this can get a bit confusing. If you want to go back and read about this later, go back and listen to it again, it might make a bit more sense. So everything that took place between the time that Pilate said, "Behold your king," and the time that Jesus was nailed to the cross or to the tree occurred between the sixth hour of John and the third hour of Mark. Now, in between the sixth hour of John and the third hour of Mark, all these things happened. Jesus was stripped of his clothes, that purple robe, his clothes that were taken away. Simon was compelled to carry the cross from Pilate's judgment hall to Golgotha. Jesus turned and gave the warning to the women in Jerusalem who were mourning for him. He was then stripped of his garments again and then offered wine mixed with myrrh before being nailed up and crucified. So this was a lengthy chain of events that occurred, which must have taken quite some time. So, what's the solution to this that makes all of this make sense? How do we make sense of all this? It's simply that John's 6th hour was the hour which the Roman government would have recorded as the time of Jesus' sentencing, while Mark's 3rd hour was the time that the Jews would have noted as the time that they saw Jesus on the cross. So in other words, John was using the Roman method of timekeeping, and Mark was using the Jewish method. Now, most believe that Mark was written to a Gentile audience. So the question is, if Mark was written to a Gentile audience, why would he use Jewish timekeeping? That seems a little bit odd. And I think the answer lies in Mark's attempt to educate the Gentile world to the Jewish ways. Mark does a lot more explaining of the Jewish customs and terms than do the other gospel writers. Mark spends a lot of time, for instance, talking about Jesus as he spent time on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, on the eastern side, where the cities of Decapolis were more of a Roman, more of a Gentile world over there. He spent more time over there, and we see a lot more of those stories in the scriptures, the gospel according to Mark. It's not surprising then that Mark would use the Jewish reckoning of time to help bring the Gentiles, as he was trying to do, into this Jewish story to help them understand what this story was a little bit better. So he was bringing them to this Jewish world. Matthew's book was written to the Jews, and his time correlates exactly with Mark's. John, however, was one of the last of the 4 Gospels written, as you know, as John lived a very long life. So he wrote about church history, wrote some of these last books. And scholars believe we shouldn't be surprised that the Apostle John was writing to a Roman world using a Roman method of timekeeping. So what are the 2 methods of timekeeping? You know them actually quite well. We practice them today. We practiced them last night. We'll practice them tonight. Here in America and around the world, the Roman method of timekeeping is a new day begins when? At midnight. That's when the new day begins for the Roman world. And we use this today in our society. But how do we reckon the Sabbath day? How do we understand when new days begin? Or any day on God's calendar. We know that it begins at sunset. We know that at dark begins a new day. As Genesis says, there was evening and there was morning. So the Jews began counting the morning daylight hours from 6 o'clock. That's what they did. That was the morning hours, which makes the 3rd hour 9 o'clock. So when you see the Jews say it's the 3rd hour, that's 9 o'clock. The Roman method of counting each day is, they counted from midnight and noon. Those were the 2 points in the middle of the path of the moon and the sun, which means the events in John would have occurred about 3 hours before the events of Mark, or around 6 a.m., which would be the 6th hour of reckoning from midnight. There is evidence we can see from Censorius, and I have multiple sources, but let me just read this one so that you understand this a bit better. Censorius was a writer. He wrote De Di Natali in 238 AD. He wrote this. He said, "As to the Romans, they have chosen the interval from midnight to midnight, witnessed the public sacrifices and even the auspices of the magistrates, ceremonies in which is attributed to the day just finished, that which was or could have been done before midnight, and to the following day, that which was done after midnight and before the rising of the day, witness the custom which gives the same natal day to children who are born in the course of 24 hours, which separates one midnight from another." And notice how he's pointing just to specifically to the birth of children. Even today, what do we say? If it's December 31, do you want your child born at 11:59, right? Or do you want it born at 12 a.m. the next year? Well, for tax purposes, you're going to want it born at 12 a.m. so you can get the tax write-off for the whole year. That is the point of demarcation on the Roman calendar. That's what we use today. So Censorius talks about how Roman timing is used for officials. And since John 19 involves Roman soldiers and Roman magistrates, we really shouldn't be surprised at the use of Roman civil time beginning at midnight here in John. So the difference in calculating time allows for John 19:14 to occur before Mark 15:25, just as Scripture indicates, and it also allows plenty of time between the two accounts for all the events which transpired between Jesus' sentencing before Pilate and carrying out that sentence on Golgotha. So the entire contradiction boils down to really nothing more than a time perspective. One author gave the time from the perspective of the Romans who were carrying out the sentence, while the other gave the time from the perspective of the Jews who demanded it. Both accounts are correct, and they are easily reconciled when take these two perspectives into account.